Hello and welcome to Rewired Mind Counseling Podcast. My name is Esther Ogbonda and I am the host of this show. Thank you for joining us for today's pioneering podcast on overcoming anxiety and depression using coping mechanisms. This will be achieved by integrating faith-based and clinical approaches and exploring ways that anxiety can be minimized, managed, or eliminated. I will be explaining my approaches in detail in my subsequent podcasts. Hello and welcome to the Rewired Minds Counseling Podcast. My name is Esther Ogbonda and I am the host for the show. However, on today's podcast, we have the pleasure of having Reverend Erica Dennis Fulton back to the episode. We had her last time and we are having her again. That's a good thing. You're welcome. Right. Thank you for joining us for today's podcast, episode 9.1, on overcoming anxiety and depression through the application of various coping skills or coping tools. So this will be achieved by integrating various faith-based and clinical approaches to discover the various or numerous ways anxiety can be lessened and managed or even eliminated completely. So Reverend Fulton will be sharing her expertise, experiences, and thoughts on trauma and low self-esteem and the effects that has on anxiety and depression. So in the previous episode, that was episode 7.1, and 7.2, Reverend Fulton shared her expertise, experiences, and thoughts on anxiety, depression, and trauma. So today we are going to look at trauma and low self-esteem. So today again, I have the pleasure of inviting you to the podcast to tell us, what we need to know. Thank you. Over to you. So this is the question and answers. All right. So I'm going to ask you a series of a set of questions, and these questions are important and they are crucial. The answers we'll get will be very beneficial. Yes. Right. So what impact does trauma have on self-esteem?
Trauma has a huge impact on self-esteem. That's actually one of the areas that trauma affects, because what ends up happening is, as a maladaptive coping strategy, and let me emphasize maladapting, we are going to change the beliefs about ourselves and the world to try to understand why such a horrendous thing has happened to us. And I want to just very briefly talk about what is called a just world belief. And that's very crucial because, in essence, that is something that we're taught as children. Basically, we are taught that if you do good things and you live right, good things will always happen to you. Yeah. And so if you're constantly told that, and then you have this horror happen to you, it completely shakes that myth that you've been told all your life. So in order to try to make some sense of it, we're going to either, avoidance, which is extremely maladaptive, or we're going to take that belief and change it. Because if I say, well, you know what, I did something to deserve this, then that just world belief makes sense. And that's been taught to us in our communities of faith. It's been taught to us in school. by our teachers as little children. And one of the hugest areas I see that people become affected by as it refers to trauma is that whole idea of self-worth, self-value, self-image, being able to see themselves apart from the trauma. You begin to look at the world through this distorted lens. You don't look at it through who God says you are. You begin to define yourself as your trauma. And many clients, that this is one of their biggest areas of struggle. And so what that can do is, if a person already has anxiety, or they already struggle with depression and or anxiety, it can actually intensify the effects that are already present. Because what starts happening is, if I keep telling myself I'm damaged, nobody's ever going to want me. I'm damaged. Nobody's ever going to want me. And I just start ruminating on that, then that is going to increase the depression very greatly. Depression often comes from the things we are telling ourselves. Yes. And a lot of times I would say to my clients, what are you saying to yourself? What have you been saying? Or, when it comes to X, Y, and Z, what are you saying to yourself that keeps causing that anxiety to keep increasing and increasing and increasing? And more than likely, it goes back to a trauma. Yeah. So I don't just look at the stuck point. I look at the activating event to understand what was the trauma and how has this shifted the person's view of themselves. We don't have a healthy view of ourselves and our abilities. We begin to second guess ourselves. And, I just use this topic, sexual assault victims. It's not very uncommon for them to believe, well, you know what, if I hadn't worn that short skirt, he wouldn't have raped me. And so I challenge that, and I say, well, so you're telling me that wearing a short skirt merits or justifies another human being violating you? Help me understand, because you said that it wasn't consensual. So clearly, when it's not consensual, at least here in America, we call that rape. And even just the self-blame and saying, oh, it's my fault, and then the shame sets in, and then the self-destructive behavior and the self-harm, and punishing yourself for something you convinced yourself was your fault. Now, am I saying there are not cases where there's valid guilt with a client? There are cases, sometimes. I'm not going to say all the time. But the main premise here, I want to really drive home and help people understand, is that whole issue of our self-image and how we see ourselves, that is very crucial. So it does not surprise me that the enemy uses that as a way to begin to have us out of our own mouth begin to tear down and discredit what God says about us, what the Creator says about who we are and the potential we have. And also, when we begin to engage in those negative beliefs, we attract people who will reinforce the negative self-image. Yeah. And I meet not just women, but men as well that say, I don't know why I keep attracting X, Y, and Z. Well, what do you believe about yourself? Because we're going to draw that. Yeah. If I feel like I'm unworthy and deserving of love, I don't deserve a good man, I don't deserve a good woman, I'm going to unconsciously go seek someone out.
That's true.
Who is unhealthy. Mm-hmm. And there are times when, if you start digging through family history, when parents say, negative things to their kids, that hurts my heart, because children remember that and they internalize that. They do. And if you're growing up being told you're stupid, what's wrong with you, why can't you figure that out, then and you're just hearing this consistently for 14 or 15 years, then that it helps me understand why you have such a low self-image, because that becomes internalized. And then that person may be one who struggles with challenges, who may even shy away from challenges because there was a consistent message throughout childhood: you're not good enough, you're not smart enough, you're not pretty enough, or my favorite one, well, what's wrong with you? Why can't you be more like your sister? But they were not created to be like their
Yeah.
sister. It is about helping that child find out who he or she is in this world. But and I don't think parents always do it from a cruel standpoint, but they don't understand how the child may interpret that. So trauma is not, and I don't want to say it's not malicious, but it, for a child, that could be very traumatic. And every child is different. But if you are constantly, well, you know what, you got a B, but why didn't you get an A? And just you hear that every time, instead of, excuse me, instead of, wow, I'm proud of you, because who's to say that child didn't try their absolute best? Well, why can't you get all A's like Jimmy, or why can't you be athletic like him? And I've had clients even say to me, even when I got A's, it was, yeah, but you could have got an A plus. And they said, I felt like the things that I did, it was never good
Appreciated.
enough.
Yeah.
So, trauma, as I said, just that whole area of self image is so huge, and it has such a impact on us as human beings that can last throughout a lifetime, good or bad. When the Word of God says that the power, of life and death lies in the tongue, if I consistently say to myself, I can't do this, I'm not smart like her, and I mean, I say that to myself every day for 30 years, it's no wonder that I struggle with being able to love myself. Trauma inhibits our ability to love ourselves. So part of what I do as a therapist is help them identify those problematic patterns of thinking in the area of their self image that may be directly tied to the rumination, which is when you keep meditating on a negative thought over and over and over, because it's a coping strategy, but it's extremely maladaptive. So, one of the things I will say, how much more powerful would it be if you begin to meditate on the alternative? I am beautiful in my own way. And they'll be like, but I just don't feel it. Or again, it can go back to being told that throughout childhood, either by a parent or a primary caregiver. Because as a kid, right, when our parents tell us things, we say, well, they're the adult, they're authority figures, so they must be right. And I've had clients where I've had to say, okay, who told you that? Well, my mother told me that. So it sounds like your evidence is, well, my mother said it, so therefore it must be true. And I challenge that and say, okay, what would you say if I told you, that sounds like that's mama's trauma that she never dealt with. And that has nothing to do with you. But it's that also that trauma, intergenerational trauma, being passed down even in terms of self-image until someone breaks the cycle and say, I will no longer live my life based on my stuck points. And I think that's a huge area where the enemy just loves to pick and pick and pick until that person is so stripped of every bit of human dignity. And that is the makeup of trauma. It truly does affect our ability to be confident, to believe in ourselves. Just that whole concept of self love is so huge.
That's true. That's true. That's correct. And it's good for, like you pointed out on something regarding parents' expectations of their children,
Yes.
having a child has gotten A, and you saying, oh, it could have been A plus, rather than instead that parent should be celebrating the success, whether be it little or more, and the celebration of that success would also motivate that child to do more, to do
Yes.
better,
Yes.
and also have self-confidence in themselves,
Yes. Yes.
and retain self-esteem, so it's a whole lot of things, celebrating one success, a child's success, whether they made a B, you move them, you encourage them, praise them, so that they
Yes.
can move on to making C and D. Otherwise, these are the sources of stress and anxiety on a child.
Yes. Then they start to feel that stress, and they start to feel like nothing I do is ever going to be good enough. And as we're talking, I remember there was an episode of Touched by an Angel, and the father was so he was such a perfectionist, and he kept pushing his son, these SATs, and you need to get A's, and so many words. What ended up happening was the son was under so much stress
Yeah,
that he ended up shooting himself, attempting suicide. And of course, it's Touched by an Angel. And come to find out, Dad had his own unresolved trauma and wounds, and he was using his son as a way to live that out. And he had no idea the amount of stress and pressure his child was under to perform perfectly, to the extent that if he felt like he didn't get the A, that was it. That was the end of the world. And I think that is a episode that highlights how trauma comes in so many different forms.
yes, it does.
And how when people have low self-image, again, I dig through childhood. I'm a very nosy therapist when it comes to that, because I'll say, what kind of things did your parents say to you? How did they affirm you? How did they praise you? And I'm not saying there shouldn't be discipline. There should be, to a proper
That's
extent. But there's also got to be praise and affirming that child. And affirmations are a powerful tool to combat the stuck points that pertain to a negative self beliefs that stem from trauma. But you can't, if you don't identify the stuck point, you can't replace it if you don't identify it. So that's why I'm huge on identifying the stuck point, challenging it, saying, let's look at the evidence here. Is the evidence a credible source? Are your parents a credible source? Because you clearly said to me they had their own trauma that they never dealt with. So it sounds like what they said and did came from a very wounded place. Can you trust when someone says something from a wounded place? Because it's coming from a distorted place, a place of their own trauma. So I'm very keen on honing in on that. And I use, and that's where the cognitive processing therapy for PTSD comes in. It works very effective with even substance abuse clients, because again, that component of self-esteem is huge, and even in recovery. So if you don't deal with the root of that trauma, and you got a person in recovery, what ends up happening is when that reminder comes up, and they don't have the proper coping strategies in place, that they're not going to have the proper tools,
Yes, yes.
because those triggers are going to come up, whether it's abuse or molestation, or maybe they were severely beaten by their father, you know. So there's, growing up in a home where you have parents who are substance abuse users. It's highly traumatic.
That's true.
So it's very imperative that even within ourselves, we're able to identify those stuck points as it relates to our self-image that we have from maybe some of our own childhood wounds. I always say no one passes through this life untouched by trauma. Yeah. And if you haven't, keep living. And that is, unfortunately, that is the reality. But that trauma doesn't have to define who you are for the rest of your life.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, yeah. That's good. Good explanation. How does someone recover from trauma in terms of self-image?
Well, one place, as I stated before, I start with is identifying that stuck point.
Okay.
Identifying it, and when I give them homework, being consistent with that homework. For example, I'll just use what we call ABC worksheets.
Yeah.
Because it's the intent and the purpose is to help you begin to link the thought to the event and to the emotion, and how that emotion is informing how you're showing up, how it's informing your behavioral response. And the thing is, it consistency. Saying affirmations, but you got to be consistent with it. It's like when the doctor gives you a prescription and he says you have to take this twice a day for a week to get rid of this cold, and you go back to him 2 weeks later and you say, "Doc, I still have the cold," and he said, "Well, did you take it like I prescribed it?" "Well, no, but I don't understand why I still have the cold." And he'll say, "Well, you didn't. You were not consistent with the process." And we live in a world where all of us, I myself included, can be very guilty. At times of, I want a quick process. I want to see results right now and right here. And I say to them, if you have said to yourself for the last 20 years, "I'm incompetent, nobody will ever hire me, nobody will ever date me, I'm not pretty enough," that's not going to shift overnight, because for the last 20 years, that has been your narrative. That's, as my pastor would say, Troy Tyrone Johnson, who I want to shout out. He's a therapist, and he's taught me a lot. But he uses a good word, narrative. If you said that narrative to yourself the last 20 years, then you have to be that much more consistent in identifying that lie and replacing it with truth. The truth that you are competent, that you are capable, that you are wonderfully and fearfully created, which means you're not going to be like the next person. You're not supposed to be. We're not carbon copies, but I believe we live in such a world where there's such a focus on the external, and there's no focus on dealing with that internal, the soul of a man. Because I believe that's part of that self-image and that self-esteem. That's got to be healthy as well. It radiates from the inside out. Because if your soul is a mess, there's no amount of makeup that could cover that up.
No way. Yeah. That's true. Well said. Right. What is the relationship between negative self-image and trauma and our ability to be confident? You got the question? Yeah. The relationship between negative self-image and trauma and our ability to be confident.
Well, the relationship For one thing, just the trauma itself, it produces the negative beliefs. And so those negative beliefs begin to impair, hinder how we show up in the world. We're not showing up as confident. We're showing up as second guessing ourselves. And that could be in terms of dating, our careers, our interactions with people, with family, the energy we bring to the room. And so the negative thoughts, the self-sabotage, for example, good example, because that's a behavior that's being informed by an emotion, and that emotion is producing a certain thought. So if I'm sitting here going, I'm just stupid, and I just repeat that, then more than likely I'm gonna feel shame, I'm gonna feel fear, and out of fear I may self-sabotage an opportunity, because going back to that thought of, oh my gosh, I may not be smart enough to do this. Oh my gosh, I'm gonna fail. It's almost, well, let me and that's why I say trauma, it we have this distorted vision,
Yeah.
because we may think, well, oh, I'm just saving myself heartache. No, you're sabotaging what could be a beautiful opportunity. Because what if you succeed? Or what if it is possible that you have become so convinced of your own incompetence that in your head you justify the self sabotage as you know what, I did myself a favor. No, you did yourself a disservice. But again, our thinking and our action and our emotion are all interconnected. It's like being able to connect the dots, like taking pieces of a puzzle and going, oh, this fits right here. Oh, this fits right here. No, this doesn't fit here. And I think self sabotage is can be one of the hugest ways that low self esteem shows up. And we wear it. Now if you've had repeated traumas, say you had some in childhood, and then in late adulthood you have some more traumas that happen, and you haven't dealt with those stuck points as it relates to self-esteem that happened when you were a child, that's going to get reactivated when that trauma happens, because then it becomes more evidence. So the stuck point becomes stronger, because in our minds, in a person's mind, all this trauma is just evidence. But that's where I come in with teaching them how to challenge the thoughts and become their own cognitive therapist. Because I tell them you have to practice this out of session. And yes, we will do some work here, but if you don't practice it out of session, it it's not going to stick. It's like learning how to play a guitar.
Yes.
You can't just practice when you're in
One day,
class.
yeah.